The master of Mississippi always picked the weakest man to fight, but no one imagined what would follow. Deep in Mississippi in 1858, Master Calvin Thornwood had a cruel ritual. Whenever a slave became too slow or too sick to work, he would summon them for one last fight in the middle of the plantation, right under the burning sun with everyone watching. The rule was plain: win and walk free, lose and die on the ground. For the master, it was a method to get rid of anyone who no longer served him and to frighten everyone else into obedience. He chose anyone he wanted: an elderly man, a thin young helper, even a feverish boy. His violence became the plantation's gruesome show. 23 men had stepped into that circle. 23 men had been beaten to death. But on a heavy August morning, something unusual happened. The man Thornwood called that day had been acting strangely for weeks, moving slower, coughing deeply, stumbling in the cotton rows. Everyone thought he was close to dying, everyone except one person. When the master shouted his challenge, the plantation fell fully silent. The weak man stepped forward without shaking, without fear in his eyes, without pausing even once. And in that moment, some of the older slaves noticed something, a pattern they had seen many years ago, a way of fighting older than the plantation itself. What came next would change everything. Thornwood had no idea what danger he had just walked into. Before we continue this powerful story of revenge, make sure you hit the subscribe button and tell us which city you're watching this fight from. Let's keep going. Thornwood Plantation covered about 4,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, the dark, rich soil that grew cotton in huge amounts. It was the type of land that made white men wealthy and made black people suffer endlessly. In 1858, the plantation was at its highest level of production. 312 slaves worked from sunrise to darkness, 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons for a little rest. They lived in rows of simple wooden cabins behind the main house, slept on rough pallets, ate small rations of cornmeal and salt pork, wore clothing made from the cheapest materials, and survived in constant exhaustion and fear. Calvin Thornwood owned all of this, had taken the plantation from his father, Richard Thornwood, in 1851. Calvin was just 28 when he became master. Young, ambitious, and determined to prove himself even harsher and more successful than his father. Richard had been a typical plantation owner, cruel certainly, but predictable in his cruelty. Whippings for disobedience, selling families apart, forcing long hours until bodies collapsed. These were common punishments that every plantation owner practiced. But Calvin wanted something different. He wanted total control, wanted his slaves to fear him in ways they had never feared his father. He studied methods of domination, read manuals about breaking wild horses, and applied those same ideas to breaking human beings. He invented ways of psychological torment, sudden acts of violence, and public displays meant to scar the mind of every slave who watched. His most terrifying display was the fights. The ritual began in March 1855. A slave named Abraham had turned 63 that year. His hands were twisted by arthritis, his back permanently bent from years and years of picking. He could no longer keep up with the younger field workers. He slowed down his entire picking group. Calvin watched him closely for about a week. Then one morning he brought him to the center of the yard. He told everyone gathered that Abraham would fight him. If Abraham won, he would go free. If he lost, then he would have no use for freedom. Abraham shook with fear, because he knew he had no real chance against a strong young white master. But what else could he do? If he refused, he would be whipped to death. Fighting at least gave him a tiny chance at survival. So Abraham lifted his stiff fists, tried to defend himself. Calvin played with him like a cat with a dying mouse for half a minute, letting Abraham swing uselessly, letting him miss every strike. Then Calvin attacked. One heavy punch to Abraham's jaw, and the old man dropped instantly. He couldn't get up. Calvin kicked him again and again, in the ribs, in the skull, in the back. He kept kicking until Abraham's body stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped living. 300 people stood there, watching helplessly. When Calvin finally stepped back, he was panting, covered in Abraham's blood, and he smiled. He looked around at the terrified faces. Anyone else want to slow down? Want to stop being useful? This is what waits for you. The message was unmistakable. Work until you collapse, or die fighting. Those were the only choices. Other plantation owners heard about Calvin's new method. Some disliked it. Charles Morrison from a nearby plantation told him he was ruining valuable property, that selling sick or old slaves was smarter than killing them. But Calvin didn't agree. "Fear is worth more than their sale price," he said. "One dead man teaches 100 others to work harder." And he was right. In the months after Abraham's brutal death, work output on Thornwood Plantation rose by 12%. People forced themselves to work through pain, hid sickness, pushed their bodies far beyond safe limits. Because the alternative was the circle, the master's blows, death in front of everyone. The system worked, and Calvin kept using it. Over the next 3 years, 23 men were killed in that circle. They weren't all old, they weren't all sick. Some were unlucky, some had a work accident that left them injured. Some got an illness that weakened them. Some developed a cough that never went away. Anything that made a slave seem slow or weak put a target on his back. Calvin watched quietly, waited until someone couldn't hide their weakness anymore, then called them into the yard and made them fight. Made them die while the rest watched. All 23 men had names, lives, families who cried for them. Abraham was the first. Then Isaac, who broke his leg and never healed right. Then Moses, who had a lung disease. Then Samuel, whose back injury meant he could not lift anything heavy. Then Josiah, who went half blind. Month after month, body after body, the deaths continued, and so did the fear. But fear also creates other feelings: anger, hatred, and in some people, a quiet wish to fight back. The slaves could not rebel openly. The laws of Mississippi made sure of that. Any group of more than 5 slaves without a white person present was illegal. Teaching slaves to read was illegal. A slave could not speak against a white person in court. The whole system existed to prevent any organized resistance. But slaves found other methods. Quiet ones, slow ones, patient ones. Ways that wouldn't be noticed until the exact moment they needed them. Elijah was one of those patient thinkers. Born in 1824 on a plantation in South Carolina. His mother's name was Ruth. He never knew the name of his father. It could have been any one of the several white men who abused his mother over the years. Elijah was sold when he was 15 after his original master died and the estate broke apart. A trader bought him, chained him to a line of 20 other slaves, and walked them all the way to Mississippi. Elijah was sold at auction in Jackson. Richard Thornwood bought him for $850 because he seemed like a strong investment. Young, tough, quick to learn, smart, but not too bold. Elijah lived on Thornwood Plantation for 19 long years. He saw Richard Thornwood run the place for 4 years. Then he watched Calvin take over in 1851. He witnessed the shift from the usual cruelty of plantation life to Calvin's new, twisted cruelty. He saw all 23 killings in the circle. Through everything, Elijah stayed careful. He played the part of the obedient worker, never drew attention, never spoke out of turn, never gave overseers a reason to notice him. He simply worked, survived, and most importantly, he observed. Elijah studied Calvin's style. Calvin was strong, around 6 feet tall and 200 pounds of muscle. He had natural physical talent, but he wasn't trained. He didn't know real fighting techniques. He relied on his size, anger, and the weakness of his opponents. Against old, sick, or frightened men, that was more than enough. But Elijah wondered, what would happen if Calvin faced someone who actually knew how to fight? Someone younger, stronger, who understood real technique? The question grew inside Elijah's mind. But Elijah didn't know formal fighting. He only knew the rough brawls that sometimes happened among slaves. No real training. No knowledge of how to beat a larger opponent. So Elijah did something dangerous, something quietly rebellious. He sought wisdom from the oldest slaves on the plantation, those who remembered Africa, those who had been taken on ships long ago, those who still held memories from before slavery. One of them was a woman named Sarah. She had lived on Thornwood Plantation for 43 years. She had been brought from West Africa in 1815 at age 22, survived the ocean crossing, survived decades of slavery, and carried within her memories older than the plantation itself. By 1858, she was 65, too old for field labor. But the plantation kept her alive because she was a skilled midwife and healer. She knew herbs, she delivered babies, she treated sicknesses. She was necessary. But Sarah also had knowledge no white person on the plantation knew about. She remembered combat techniques from her Igbo homeland. The Igbo people of what is now Nigeria had warrior traditions. They knew how to fight bigger opponents, knew hidden weak points on the body, knew how to use an enemy's strength against him. This knowledge had no place in slavery. Using it openly would mean death. But Sarah kept it in her mind. And when Elijah approached her one quiet evening, asking if she knew anything about fighting, she looked at him carefully and understood exactly what he intended. "You want to face the master," she whispered. She said it without needing an answer. It wasn't a question at all. They stood alone near the well where no one could listen in. Elijah nodded slowly. "I'm tired of seeing people die, tired of living in fear every day. I want to do something. Even if it costs me my life, I want to at least try." Sarah watched him carefully. She saw the resolve in him, the steady anger that had been growing for 19 long years. At last she spoke. "I can teach you. Not everything. Learning it all would take years, but enough. Enough to maybe win if he isn't expecting a real fight." Over the following months, Sarah trained Elijah in secret. After nightfall, in hidden corners of the plantation, she showed him where to strike for the most damage: the solar plexus to steal breath, the liver to cause crippling pain, the throat to choke off air, the eyes to blind, the knees to collapse. She taught him how to use leverage so a smaller person could topple a bigger one, how to turn force aside instead of meeting it head-on. She showed him footwork, how to shift his weight, how to avoid blows, how to create openings. It was ancient knowledge passed down through bloodlines, now changed into a weapon for one desperate purpose. But knowing how to fight wasn't enough. Elijah needed a chance. He needed Calvin to choose him for the circle. But Calvin only picked the weak, the dying, the ones who clearly couldn't keep up anymore. So Elijah needed to appear weak. He needed to convince everyone, including Calvin, that he was fading, that he had become a burden, that he deserved to be called out next. In June 1858, Elijah began his act. He slowed his steps in the field, dropped his cotton sack like his fingers couldn't hold it, stumbled over nothing, coughed as though sickness was tightening around his lungs. At first it was small, easy to overlook. But he kept it up day after day, week after week. His pretend weakness grew worse. He ate less, lost weight on purpose, made his cheeks hollow and his eyes sunken. He let his shoulders droop until he looked smaller than he truly was. He moved like every task hurt him. The overseers took notice. Marcus Kane, the head overseer for 6 brutal years, watched him daily. He told Calvin that Elijah seemed to be falling apart quickly. "Don't know what's wrong with him," Marcus said. "Could be consumption, could be he's just worn out, but he's slowing down the whole line." Calvin came to watch him himself. For several days he stood near the fields, studying Elijah. He saw the stumbling, the desperate coughing, the seeming weakness. He made his judgment. Elijah was nearly done, soon to be useless. Time for another show of dominance. Calvin began planning his next example, but someone else saw through Elijah's performance. Sarah, of course, because she was guiding it. But there was also Grace. She was 23, born on Thornwood Plantation, beautiful even after a life of suffering, and she loved Elijah deeply. They had been together 2 years. Not married, slaves couldn't legally marry, but bound in all the ways that mattered. Grace knew Elijah's real strength. She knew his sharp mind, and she understood quickly what he was doing. One night she confronted him inside his cabin. "You're planning something," she said quietly. "Planning to get picked. Planning to fight Calvin." Elijah didn't pretend otherwise. He couldn't lie to her. "I have to do something. I can't just wait to get old and die in that circle like everyone else." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You'll die anyway. Even if you somehow win, they'll kill you afterward. You know there's no way out." Elijah held her hands gently. "Maybe. Probably. But I'd rather die fighting than die begging. I'd rather die trying to hurt him than die for his amusement. And maybe there's a chance I don't die. Maybe there's a way to break free." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine a future with hope. But she had seen 23 men die already. Nothing suggested Elijah would be any different. "If you do this," she whispered, "I'm going to lose you. One way or another, you'll be gone." "Then come with me," Elijah said softly. "If I live, if I escape, run with me, be free with me." Grace stepped back, shaking her head. "That's just a dream. Nobody escapes Mississippi. Slave catchers always find runaways. And even if you reach the north, I'm a woman. I can't run like you. I'll slow you down. I'll get us both caught." Tears were running down her cheeks. "I love you," she said, "but I can't watch you die in that circle. When they call your name, I'll look away. I can't see it happen." Elijah understood. It was too heavy a burden for her. He held her while she cried, memorizing everything about her, the warmth of her skin, the way her hair smelled, because he knew the truth. This might be their last night together. His plan would end in either freedom or death. Either outcome meant this life was over. After she left, Elijah lay awake for hours. He thought about stopping, about staying silent, about simply surviving as long as he could, but he knew he couldn't. He had gone too far. He had devoted too much. There was no turning back. The call came on August 15th, 1858, a Monday. The air was thick even before sunrise. By noon it would be scorching. The field workers gathered in the yard for assignments. Overseers were forming crews when Calvin walked out of the big house. He wore a light linen shirt, dark pants, polished boots. He walked with the confidence of a man who had killed 23 people with his bare hands and believed he could never be defeated. Marcus Kane rang the bell. 3 sharp clangs. Everyone froze. Everyone knew what that sound meant. Someone was about to die. Work stopped. All 312 slaves gathered. They knew the ritual. They had seen it too many times. The circle of dirt, the master's fists, the quick, hopeless beatings. Some looked empty, some trembled. Everyone felt trapped. Calvin looked over the crowd slowly. He let fear grow. He enjoyed the way the silence deepened. Finally, he spoke. "We've got dead weight on this plantation," he said. "People who take more than they give. People who've become useless." His gaze locked on Elijah. "Elijah, step forward." The crowd opened a path. Elijah walked through, head low, shoulders drooping, every step looking like pain. He stopped 15 feet from Calvin, didn't raise his head, stayed in character perfectly. "You've been getting weaker," Calvin said, "turning useless. I've watched you stumble around coughing, barely doing anything, so we'll settle it the usual way. You and me, right here, right now, same rules as ever. You win, freedom. You lose." Calvin gave that horrible smile everybody feared. "You won't have to worry about working anymore." The white overseers laughed, 6 of them, armed with whips and clubs, forming a loose ring around the yard. no one could interfere. They'd watched 23 fights just like this. They expected another dead man and another reminder of their master's power. But something made Calvin stop. Elijah lifted his head slowly. He looked Calvin straight in the eyes, and he smiled. Not a scared smile, not a submissive smile, a confident smile, a smile that said he knew something Calvin didn't. "I accept your challenge, Master," Elijah said. "Let's see what happens." The way he said "master" was wrong, filled with sarcasm, filled with quiet defiance. It shouldn't have been possible. Calvin felt something unfamiliar, doubt, but he couldn't back out, not with so many watching. "Marcus," he snapped, "mark the circle." Marcus scratched a 20-foot circle into the dirt, the same circle that had already taken 23 lives. Soon, they all thought, it would take the 24th. Calvin pulled off his shirt, showing his strong body, 6 feet tall, heavy with muscle, arms thick from riding and work, chest broad, shoulders wide. At 35, he was in his prime. He looked dangerous because he was dangerous. Some slaves gasped. Their fear grew. How could anyone fight a man like that? Then Elijah took off his shirt, and everything shifted. He was not weak at all. His body was lean, carved with muscle. Scars crossed his arms, chest, and back. 19 years of slavery written on skin. But beneath the scars was power. Real power. Not the fake frailty he'd shown for months. Grace gasped softly. Sarah nodded with the slightest approval. A few older slaves who had suspected smiled quietly. The truth was out. Calvin stared, rage rising. "You've been pretending, making me believe you were falling apart, making me look like a fool." Elijah shrugged. "You believed what you wanted. That's not my mistake. That's yours." The boldness shocked everyone. A slave talking like that, standing like that, it wasn't normal. It wasn't allowed. Calvin's fists tightened. "I'm going to kill you slowly, make you regret every word." "Maybe," Elijah said calmly. "Or maybe today you learn you're not unstoppable, that you can be beaten, that you can bleed, that you can die." He rolled his shoulders, loosened his neck, bounced lightly on his toes. He moved like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Calvin felt his doubt grow stronger, but so did his fury. This slave needed to be destroyed, needed to be made an example. Marcus raised his hand. The moment it dropped, the fight began. Calvin charged forward instantly, using the same tactic he always relied on. Pure aggression, rushing in fast, trying to overwhelm his opponent with size and raw violence. It had worked for him 23 times before. But this time Elijah didn't back up, didn't freeze, didn't panic. At the very last moment he stepped aside, letting Calvin's own momentum push him past. As Calvin stumbled forward, Elijah drove his elbow sharply into Calvin's ribs, hitting with perfect aim, using all his weight and leverage behind the strike. 2 ribs cracked. The sound was soft, but the pain was brutal. Calvin gasped as agony shot through his chest. He had never felt anything like this in his fights. He had always been the one causing pain, never the one suffering it. The shock hit him almost as hard as the injury. He spun around, breathing in ragged bursts, and saw Elijah smiling calmly. "That's for Abraham," Elijah said in a low but clear voice, "for the first man you killed." With a roar, Calvin charged again and threw a heavy fist at Elijah's head. But Elijah ducked under the swing, slid inside his reach, and struck 3 fast punches into Calvin's torso, solar plexus, liver, kidney. Sarah's lessons: aim for the soft places, the spots that hurt the most, the spots that disable rather than just wound. All 3 hits landed perfectly. Calvin staggered backward. Every breath burned with sharp pain from the broken ribs. The liver shot sent a sickening wave through his body that almost made him collapse. The kidney strike sent spasms down his back. He was hurt, really hurt, and the fight had barely even begun. Around them, the slaves stood completely silent. Nothing about this matched their expectations. The slave was supposed to lose. The master was supposed to win easily, beating the life out of his opponent in minutes. But Elijah wasn't losing. Elijah was winning, strongly. He moved faster, hit smarter, fought with purpose. Calvin looked slow and clumsy next to him. The meaning of this was enormous. If a master could be beaten, then a master could be resisted. If he could bleed, if he could fall, then maybe the whole system wasn't unbreakable after all. Calvin tried to grapple next, thinking that strength alone could save him. He rushed forward, threw his arms around Elijah, lifted him off the ground, and tried to throw him down. But Elijah twisted at the last second, using the techniques Sarah had spent months drilling into him. He shifted his weight, found the leverage he needed, and turned Calvin's power against him. Calvin suddenly felt his balance disappear. His feet left the earth. He was the one flying through the air and smashing into the dirt. Dust burst up around him as the fall knocked the breath out of his lungs. Before he could even begin to recover, Elijah was already on top of him, mounting his chest and raining down blows, face, throat, temples. Every punch was calculated, every strike meant to destroy. Calvin tried to raise his hands to shield himself, but he couldn't stop the brutal rhythm. His nose cracked, blood poured out, his lips split open, teeth broke, one of his eyes began to swell shut. Elijah's beating wasn't wild, it was controlled, focused, the result of 19 years of swallowed rage, now being released with perfect precision. Marcus Cain, the overseer, finally started moving in to stop it. The master was losing, dangerously and publicly. This could not continue. But Sarah stepped right in front of him, an old woman blocking a strong young overseer. "The master said it was a fair fight," she said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "He said the rules were simple: win and get freedom, lose and die. Those were his words. If you interfere now, you prove his word means nothing. You prove he can't win his own fights." Marcus froze. She was exactly right. Calvin had made this public and spoken the rules himself. If the overseers jumped in now, it would show everyone that a master's promise meant nothing, that even with all his talk of strength, Calvin couldn't win without help. The other overseers looked around unsure, wanting to intervene but trapped by the rules their master had created. Inside the circle, Elijah kept striking. Calvin was barely conscious now. His face was destroyed, blood everywhere, bones cracked. He tried weakly to push Elijah away, but he had nothing left. No strength, no defense, no power. He was being beaten to death in front of the people who were supposed to fear him, obey him, respect him. Finally, Elijah stopped. He stood up, breathing hard, looking down at Calvin, who lay nearly unconscious, bleeding heavily, barely able to breathe. "You said I'd win my freedom," Elijah announced, raising his voice so the entire crowd could hear. "Those were your rules. I won. That means I'm free." He turned and looked at the slaves, then at the overseers, making sure every witness heard him. He wanted it recorded in their memories. "I won according to his own rules. I am free." Silence followed. Heavy, absolute silence. Everyone, slaves and whites, was frozen with shock. Then Marcus finally spoke. "You're a dead man," he said flatly. "Even if you won the fight, you won't live long enough to enjoy it. We'll hunt you down. We'll kill you. Slow, painful. We'll make an example out of you." Elijah nodded. "Probably. But for this moment, right now, I'm free. I beat him. And I want all of you to remember this." His eyes fixed on the slaves again. "Remember that he's just a man, that he bleeds, that he can fall. Remember that you don't have to accept this forever. That resistance is possible. When your time comes, be ready. Be brave. Fight back." That was when the other whites came running, neighboring plantation owners, guests from the big house, overseers from the far fields. They rushed toward the scene after hearing the shouting. They came to end the chaos, to restore order, to show power. Within minutes, 20 armed white men surrounded Elijah. Guns, whips, clubs, too many to count. One man against 20. No hope. But Sarah had prepared for this moment. She had spent weeks planning it, gathering allies, building a strategy. As soon as the whites closed in, she shouted a single word in Igbo, her native tongue. A word none of the whites understood. Ugbua, now. And the plantation exploded into coordinated disorder. 60 slaves moved at the same time, not attacking, which would have been death, but creating noise and chaos. They ran in different directions, shouted, dropped tools with loud clangs, threw the surroundings into confusion. The whites couldn't aim, couldn't fire without risking each other, couldn't even chase Elijah because everything around them was moving at once. For a few precious seconds, they were blinded by noise and motion. Elijah ran. He sprinted toward the trees, toward the woods, toward the small chance of survival. Gunshots cracked behind him. Bullets whipped through the air. Most missed, but one tore through his left shoulder. The impact spun him sideways and knocked him to the ground. Pain shot through his arm and chest, but he forced himself back up and kept running. He reached the trees and vanished into the forest. Behind him, Thornwood Plantation dissolved into uproar, shouting, dogs barking, overseers yelling orders. The hunt had begun, but the chaos had bought Elijah time. By the time the whites organized themselves and prepared the dogs, Elijah had already earned a 15-minute lead. And he had prepared for this. He had spent weeks mapping escape routes, marking trees in secret ways only he would recognize, burying supplies along possible paths, creating misleading trails. His shoulder burned with pain, the wound bleeding badly, but the bullet had passed through muscle without breaking bone or hitting anything vital. It hurt, it weakened him, it would likely get infected soon, but it wouldn't kill him immediately. He ran for nearly an hour before stopping at a hidden supply cache, where he grabbed bandages, food, a small knife, and water. He wrapped his wound quickly and forced himself back into motion. The next 3 days blurred together. He traveled mostly at night, slept in hidden places, followed streams to confuse the dogs, avoided every road and settlement. The wound grew infected by day 2. Fever came. He shivered despite the burning August heat. But he kept going north, always north, guided by the North Star, guided by the thought of freedom. Back at Thornwood, the situation was spiraling. Calvin survived, but barely. He spent 2 weeks in bed. The doctor said he would live, but he would never be the same. The broken bones healed wrong. His face was permanently disfigured. He lost his right eye. Pain lived in him now, but worse than that was the loss of his image, his power. He had been beaten in front of everyone. His fear, his aura, was gone. The other plantation owners were horrified. Not by Calvin's cruelty, they largely approved of that, but by his failure. He had let a slave defeat him. He had set a dangerous example. The news spread quickly. Within days, every slave for miles knew the story of Elijah beating Master Thornwood. It gave them hope. It gave them ideas. It gave them belief. The owners tried to lie, tried to twist the story, saying Elijah cheated, saying Calvin was sick, inventing excuses. But the slaves had seen it with their own eyes, and no lie could erase what they now knew was true. Calvin sent slave hunters after Elijah, professional trackers who specialized in chasing runaways. He put up a $1,000 reward, a huge amount at the time, enough to attract hunters from several states. They searched for weeks. They found signs of him, blood on leaves from his injured shoulder, footprints in soft mud, the remains of small campfires, but they never caught him. They never even came close, because Elijah wasn't alone. He had help. The Underground Railroad, the hidden network that helped enslaved people escape to free states, had been watching Thornwood Plantation for months. They knew about Calvin's cruelty, knew he was one of the worst slaveholders in the region. Conductors had been searching for any chance to help someone escape. When word spread that Elijah had fought back and run, they acted immediately. They organized riders, sent coded messages, and spread out to look for him. They found him in Tennessee, barely alive, his wound infected, his body weak from fever, exhaustion, and little food. But he had made it out of Mississippi. He was close to freedom. The conductors hid him in a root cellar for 2 weeks. They cleaned his wound, treated the infection, fed him nourishing food, and let him regain some strength. Once he was stable, they moved him along the network, first from Tennessee to Kentucky, then from Kentucky to Ohio. Every step was risky. Every river crossing, every border, every safe house carried danger. But the conductors were skilled. They had helped hundreds of runaways before and knew the safest paths, the reliable allies, and the traps set by slave catchers. In October 1858, Elijah crossed into Ohio. He collapsed inside the home of a Quaker family named Miller. He was burning with fever, half conscious. The Millers cared for him for weeks. Slowly, his strength returned. His shoulder healed. And for the first time in his life, Elijah stood on land where he was legally free. Not property, not livestock, but a human being with rights. Freedom, however, did not come without grief. Elijah had left people behind. Grace, the woman he loved, Sarah, the woman who had trained him to fight, and the 60 enslaved people who had created chaos at the plantation so he could escape. Later, Elijah learned what happened to them. Sarah had been whipped almost to death as punishment. 3 others were sold south into the Deep South. Grace was sold to a plantation in Alabama, all because they helped him. The guilt crushed him. He had gained his freedom at the cost of their suffering. Determined to save them, Elijah tried to organize a rescue mission. He contacted abolitionists, offered to guide a raid himself, even volunteered to return to Mississippi. But abolitionist leaders refused. It was too dangerous, they said, too likely to fail, too likely to get everyone killed. They told him the best thing he could do was survive, build a life, show others that escape was possible, become a symbol of hope. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was the only choice that made sense. In 1861, the Civil War began. Elijah volunteered immediately. He joined the 1st Kansas-Colored Infantry, one of the earliest black regiments. He was 37 years old, but strong, experienced, and battle-hardened from years of surviving brutality. He fought at Island Mound in 1862. He fought at Honey Springs in 1863. He survived multiple battles and rose to the rank of sergeant. He led his men with courage. He killed Confederate soldiers without hesitation, not out of hatred for individuals, but because each one represented the system that had enslaved him. Every shot felt like justice. When the war ended in 1865, Elijah was 41. He returned to Mississippi with the Union occupation forces. He went back to Thornwood Plantation. It was burned and abandoned. Calvin had fled before the Union Army arrived and was never seen again. The U.S. government seized the land. It was supposed to be redistributed to freed people, but the promise was broken. Eventually, the plantation was sold to northern investors. The people who had worked the land for generations received nothing. Elijah found Sarah still alive. She had survived the war. She was 72, free, but with no home, no support, no money. Elijah took her north, settled her in Cincinnati, paid for her care, and visited her often. She told stories of the past, stories no history book cared to record. She lived 3 more years and died in 1868. Her last words to Elijah were, "You made it count. You made my sacrifice worth something. Thank you." Elijah searched for Grace. He learned she had been sold multiple times. The last record of her placed her near Mobile, Alabama. But when Elijah traveled there in 1866, he learned she had died of cholera in 1864. She never saw the end of slavery. She never learned Elijah survived. She never knew he came back for her. The loss shattered him. He had dreamed of finding her, of building a life with her. That hope died with her. Elijah settled in Ohio and married a woman named Rebecca in 1867. She was a former slave from Kentucky. She understood his nightmares, his grief, his survivor's guilt. Together they built a new life. They had 7 children. They worked the land, saved money, bought property, and raised their children in freedom, taught them to read, to write, to dream, to reach for things Elijah never had the chance to have. But Elijah never forgot August 15, 1858. He never forgot the fight. He never forgot the people who helped him escape. He told his story again and again, to his children, to his grandchildren, to anyone who listened. He wanted it recorded. He wanted it to survive. He wanted no one to forget the day a slave fought his master and won. The day the impossible became real. The day courage changed everything. Elijah lived until 1903, dying at age 79. By then he had 14 grandchildren and 23 great-grandchildren, all free, all educated, all aware of what their grandfather had done. Over 200 people attended his funeral, both black and white, soldiers who had served with him, abolitionists who had helped him escape, friends, family, and neighbors. He was buried outside Cincinnati. His gravestone read, Elijah Freeman, born into bondage 1824, died in freedom 1903. He fought back. The story of Elijah and Calvin spread through black communities, passed from generation to generation. It was told as proof that enslaved people could fight back, that slaveholders were not invincible, that resistance was real. Over time, the story grew. Some said Elijah killed Calvin. Some said he freed all the slaves on the plantation. Some claimed he was 7 feet tall or fought 10 men at once. The truth was simpler but powerful. A slave beat his master in open combat and escaped to freedom. White historians tried to erase the story. They said it never happened. They said it was a myth meant to inspire slave revolts. But the records existed. Court papers showing Calvin Thornwood's plantation, census documents listing enslaved people, 1858 newspapers mentioning a violent incident at the estate, and military records proving a man named Elijah Freeman served in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. Anyone willing to look could find the truth. In 2010, local historians and civil rights groups succeeded in getting a historical marker installed on County Road 12, where Thornwood Plantation once stood. The land is farmland now, soybeans and corn where cotton once grew. But the marker finally acknowledged what happened. It reads, Site of Thornwood Plantation, 1847-1865. In August 1858, an enslaved man named Elijah defeated his master, Calvin Thornwood, in single combat and escaped to freedom. His courage inspired countless others to resist oppression. It is a small acknowledgement, far from complete, but better than silence, better than pretending the story never existed. People visit the site. Elijah's descendants come. Civil rights groups bring students. Visitors leave flowers or stones, small signs of respect for the man who refused to accept his chains, who fought back, who won. What do you think of Elijah's story? Was his violence justified? Should he have run instead of fighting? Should the others have helped him knowing the punishment that would follow? Should Elijah feel guilty for the suffering that came after? These questions are complicated. Resistance is never simple. Courage always carries a cost, and surviving when others don't creates a heavy burden. But one thing is clear. Elijah chose not to accept his fate. He chose to resist. He chose freedom, even when the price was high. His story matters because it destroys the myth that enslaved people were passive, that they waited to be rescued, that they did not resist. Elijah's story shows the truth. Resistance was constant. People fought in every way they could. They were intelligent, strategic, and brave. The system of slavery needed extreme violence to survive because enslaved people never stopped pushing back. If this story moved you, share it. Let others know that courage matters, that resistance is always possible, that systems of oppression are not permanent. History is full of moments when ordinary people refused to bow down, when someone stood up despite overwhelming odds, when someone fought back and won. Be that person when your moment comes. Until the next video.